Okay, guys, welcome. This is going to be our very first street law lecture series, so I do want to explain a few things about how it's going to work in my system before we really get into the content of this. First off, being that this is our first lecture series, this is going to last us a couple of days, so I need you to be certain that you title this Creating a Republic, Not a Democracy. As this lecture series will go on for a couple of days, we're going to get through about half of it today, and then we're going to get through the other half when I see you again later on. So in the future, I'm going to ask you to pull out these same lecture notes as we're going to continue from where we left off today. Now, with that said, what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking about the founding of our government and the founding of our nation, as far as what is going to be our principles for making law and the government itself. Now, first, I do want to go ahead and just explain my system by going through this first slide. Now, I want to kind of explain this just in piecemeal, and then we'll talk about content. So first off, this right here, the big bullet point on the left, is going to be the big idea for this particular slide. Now, in the future, it might continue on into slides going forward, and I'll have a continued sign when it comes with that. But I do just want to give you my system where the bullet point that's on the left side is going to be the main point. Any bullet point that's indented and underneath it simply supports that bigger idea. Now, with that said, I want to go ahead and tell you, what I project in the PowerPoint is really going to be just the absolute basics. Everything else that I'm lecturing about, it's your responsibility to write down anything that you think is important that pertains to what we're discussing, as I simply can't fit everything on a PowerPoint slide. So you got to be certain that you're writing throughout our lecture series. Now, with that said, I want to go ahead and start content at this point. Be certain that you get these down in your notebooks. Now, first, I do want to explain something about this founder. This is James Madison. Now, James Madison has this famous quote where he says, "Democracy is the most vile form of government." Now, when people read this on its own, they think that Madison is in fact denigrating or in fact impugning democracy itself, where that's not necessarily true. Where Madison was a huge proponent of having the will of the people be heard. In fact, he was part of the American Revolution. He fought to rid us of a tyrannical king and a tyrannical government. This one particular quote of his, though, is representative of his thoughts, because Madison is the author of the Constitution. He writes out the foundational document that makes the American government. And as he says, and as the founders say themselves, they're terrified of democracy, of pure democracy. In a pure democracy, every single person votes on absolutely everything within that nation. A pure democracy is the rule of the mob. This is what Madison's referring to when he says democracy. Pure democracy is the most vile form of government because it simply gives power to a nameless, faceless mob of people. Madison, much like the founders, are going to be terrified of giving all this power. So they're going to be certain that when they create a new government, that power is in fact limited. For the first time in human history, what Madison and the other founders are going to do is limit what the government can do. The one thing that really all the founders could agree upon is that they didn't want to create a new government after the miraculous revolution against the British Crown that was just as tyrannical as the government they had overthrown. In fact, one of the founders said his famous quote, "I will not trade one dictatorship for another." What he's saying is that during the revolution, we were fighting against a king that was above the law, that was judge, jury, and executioner, that had literally limitless power. And the subjects of his empire were simply existent to serve him. This is where the founders are going to take a turn, where they are going to, in one way or another, tell the king, no, you have it backwards. We do not exist to serve you. You exist to serve us. This is what the founders believed was the purpose of government, that ultimate power lies with the citizenry. Now, that power can be very dangerous. There's an old saying that says power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The British monarchs had absolute power. They could do whatever they wanted. In fact, they'd had absolute power for centuries before this. There was really only one small limitation to what they could do, and average citizens had no access to that. What these founders of America are going to say is, if we are going to take on the British Empire, if we are going to overthrow the British Empire from the American colonies, if we are going to take off the yoke of British power and create a new government, we're going to create one that's limited. For the first time in human history, what the American founders will do is they create a government that is told what it cannot do, versus every other nation before it said what the government can do. Madison and his fellow founders had one thing in common. In fact, these men didn't even really get along. A lot of them actually hated each other. But there was one thing they could all agree upon, that their government needs to be strong enough to preserve order. It needs to be strong enough to protect life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness, but not so strong that it threatens liberty, that it threatens your individual prosperity. There's a saying from the 1800s, a man by the name of Henry Ward Beecher, who says, "Liberty is the soul's right to breathe, and when it cannot take a long breath, laws are girded too tight. Without liberty, man is a syncope or unconscious." What the founders believe in is the individual. They believe in the individual because there's something that the government doesn't understand. They don't understand individuals. There is no way that a government can promote your happiness, your prosperity better than an individual can, because the government doesn't know you. The individual knows him or herself. And the founders believed in this, that the power of government relies in the individual. Now, that delicate balance of creating a government that's strong enough to preserve order, but not so strong that it threatens liberty, is a very delicate balancing act. What Madison creates in the Constitution is a system that limits what the government can do in what's called the Madisonian Model. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the very basics of the Madisonian Model, of how we are going to limit what the government can do. And Madison creates a system written out in the Constitution of 4 major pillars. 4 big ideas that will go into practice that will limit what the government can do. Now, I'm just going to give you a list of those 4. Today, we're only going to get through the first 2 of them, however. Now, those 4 pillars of the Madisonian Model are separation of powers, checks and balances on those powers, the federalism system, and limiting the majority control. Now, like I said, we're only going to get to cover 2 out of these 4 today. We're going to cover the other 2 a little bit later on. So I do want to emphasize something about the Madisonian Model. What he believes is, and this is going to be a quote from the Constitutional Convention when they're actually writing out what the Constitution will be. The founders were terrified of an overly powerful government. They equated a government to fire, where they said fire, when controlled properly, can protect you. It can keep you warm, it can cook your food, but allowed to run amok, fire will destroy you. This is what they say about government power, where it needs to be limited, it needs to be separated, and it needs to be controlled, because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What Madison and the founders believe in when they create the Constitution is they have a system of government that will limit that power. Now, like I say, we're only going to get through the first 2 today. I use these first 2 today because you've probably heard of these before. The first thing that Madison says, in order to control government power, in order to control that fire, we are going to separate out the powers of government. We are going to separate the powers into 3 branches. The first branch, and perhaps the founders' favorite branch of government, what they outline in Article 1 of the Constitution, is the legislative branch. Now, our legislative branch is in fact divided into two. Our legislative branch is the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. Now, I'm certain that you've at least heard of this in basic civics, but the House of Representatives and the Senate are going to be the representatives of the American people. The House has 435 members, each member representing a district within their state. Now, just to give you an example, Colorado, we have 7 districts, which means we have 7 members in the House of Representatives. Representation in the House is based on your state's population. Now, we're a fairly small state, so we only have 7 representatives. A massive state like California, the biggest state in the union, they have 53 representatives in the House. So it's based on your state's population. The Senate, on the other side, is equal representation. Each state, no matter how big or small your population is, gets 2 senators. So it's equal representation in the Senate. Now, the founders split up. They divided this branch because they believed that it inherently had the most amount of power. They gave it the most amount of power. So they wanted to be certain that the House and the Senate compete against each other. Their job is to make the laws. They create them. They write them out. In order for a law to be created, it has to pass by a majority vote in the House and in the Senate, meaning that one side of Congress can kill a bill from the other side. This is what limits the power of government. It stops them from doing anything. One of these sides of Congress can stop the other from making a law. Now, moving on, next the founders created the executive branch. Now, the executive branch made the founders nervous. So they only gave the executive branch in Article 2 a certain number of powers. The executive branch is going to be headed by the president and the vice president. Now, there's a huge amount of power that resides in this one person. So the founders wanted to be certain that that person could be limited, could be controlled, because his job is to enforce the laws. He takes the laws passed by Congress and puts them into action. Now, today, the power of the president has expanded considerably beyond any kind of vision that the founders could have ever imagined. And the reason why that power has expanded is basically because the American people have allowed it to happen. Just to kind of give you an idea, we put the power of the nuclear arsenal in the hands of one person. We allow the president to make a choice and launch the entire nuclear arsenal should he believe that we're in danger. Now, again, the founders could have never imagined that in their wildest dreams. So the Constitution limits on presidential power has taken some different kind of twists and turns throughout the centuries. Now, we'll talk more about that going forward. But the third branch is the judicial branch. Now, judicial is a little bit strange because even the founders weren't even quite certain what the judicial branch was going to do. They knew it had to exist, but they weren't quite sure of what their powers were going to be. So in Article 3 of the Constitution, the founders created the federal court system. They allowed the courts to exist, and they basically told them, you need to figure out what your job's going to be, because your job is to interpret the laws, to say what the laws mean. Now, we'll get into it more later as we get to constitutional law, but this is the basics of separation of powers. Now, I will tell you this. I'm running out of time on my limit of what I can record, so I'm going to have this as just step 1. I do want to give you step 2 and the second pillar of the Madisonian model. So when you're finished with this one, you're going to see that there's another one that's going to be coming up very shortly.